The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras ready. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a heavyweight boxer from East London whose calloused hands told stories of countless fights in dimly lit gyms. At 28, Marcus had built a reputation in the underground boxing circuit. But today he wasn't thinking about his next match. He was thinking about his daughter. Sarah had been diagnosed with leukemia 6 months ago, and the medical bills were crushing his family. Despite his wins in the ring, Marcus struggled to make ends meet. His wife Emma worked double shifts at the hospital, but it wasn't enough. The stress had taken its toll on their marriage, and Marcus felt like he was failing as a father and husband. That morning, Emma had received another call from the hospital about overdue payments. The conversation had ended in tears and harsh words. Marcus left the house feeling defeated, walking the streets of London aimlessly until he found himself outside the palace gates. Something about the grandeur and stability of the place drew him in, stark contrast to the chaos in his own life. The crowd around him buzzed with excitement as the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Tourists snapped photos and chatted in various languages, but Marcus stood silently, lost in thought. He watched the perfectly groomed guards in their iconic red tunics and tall black hats, their faces stoic and unmovable. These men represented everything he wasn't: disciplined, secure, respected. As the ceremony began, Marcus found himself studying one particular guard more closely. The man stood ramrod straight, his rifle held with precision, eyes fixed forward. There was something familiar about his posture, the way he carried himself. Marcus had seen that stance before in the boxing gym, where fighters learned to stand their ground no matter what came their way. The crowd pressed closer to the gates, and Marcus was pushed forward until he was nearly touching the iron bars. A group of rowdy teenagers began making jokes about the guards, trying to get them to break character. They made funny faces and shouted crude comments, but the guards remained unmoved. Professional to their core, one particularly obnoxious teenager began mimicking the guard's stance, mocking the ceremony. The crowd laughed, but Marcus felt a surge of anger. These men were serving their country with honor, and here were these kids making a joke of it. His own frustrations about his powerless situation began to bubble over. Without thinking, Marcus stepped forward and placed a firm hand on the teenager's shoulder. "Show some respect," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding attention in the ring. The teenager looked up at Marcus's imposing frame, 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle, and immediately backed down. The incident caught the attention of several tourists, who began whispering and pointing. Marcus realized he had drawn unwanted attention to himself, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He found himself making eye contact with the same guard he had been watching. For just a moment, the guard's eyes flickered with what Marcus could have sworn was recognition or appreciation. As the ceremony continued, Marcus noticed more details about the guard's discipline and dedication. They stood for hours without moving, enduring the heat, the crowd, and the constant scrutiny. It reminded him of the mental toughness required in boxing, the ability to endure pain and pressure while maintaining focus on the goal. A parallel struck him deeply. These guards were fighters too, just in a different arena. They fought against distraction, against discomfort, against the urge to break character. Their battlefield was this courtyard. Their weapon was unwavering discipline. A middle-aged woman standing next to Marcus noticed his intense focus on the guards. "First time seeing the ceremony?" she asked with a kind smile. She spoke with a slight accent that Marcus couldn't quite place. "Yeah," Marcus replied, not taking his eyes off the guards. "It's something else. My husband served in the Queen's Guard 20 years ago," she continued. "People think it's just standing around, but it requires incredible mental strength. These men are elite soldiers, not just ceremonial figures." Marcus nodded, finally understanding why he felt such a connection to what he was witnessing. The discipline, the dedication, the ability to perform under pressure, these were all qualities he recognized from his own world of professional boxing. As the ceremony neared its end, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He had been carrying a small photograph of Sarah in his wallet. One taken before she got sick, when her cheeks were still full and her smile bright. He pulled it out and looked at it, then at the guards, and back at the photo. The crowd began to disperse as the ceremony concluded, but Marcus remained. He watched as the guards prepared to march away, their movements synchronized and precise. The guard he had been observing caught his eye once more. This time, Marcus was certain he saw a slight nod of acknowledgement. That small gesture ignited something inside Marcus. For months, he had felt helpless, like he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. But watching these men maintain their composure and dignity under pressure reminded him of his own strength. He was a fighter, not just in the ring, but in life, as the last of the tourists filtered away. Marcus approached the gate, where a single guard remained on duty. The man's face was impassive, but his eyes were alert and intelligent. Marcus could see the discipline and training that had shaped this soldier, and he felt a sudden urge to connect with someone who understood what it meant to stand your ground when everything around you was falling apart. Marcus stood before the ornate palace gates, his heart pounding harder than it did before any fight. The remaining guard was a tall, lean man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His nameplate read Guardsman Williams, and despite his youthful face, there was an old-soul quality about him that commanded respect. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting golden light across the palace grounds. Most tourists had moved on to other attractions, leaving the area relatively quiet. Marcus knew this was his moment, though he wasn't entirely sure what he hoped to accomplish. "Excuse me," Marcus said, stepping closer to the gate. His voice carried the rough edges of his East London upbringing, a stark contrast to the refined atmosphere of the palace. "I know you probably can't talk while you're on duty, but I wanted to say something." Guardsman Williams remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But Marcus caught the slightest tilt of his head, a sign that he was listening. Encouraged, Marcus continued. "I'm a boxer," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "Professional heavyweight. I've been fighting for 15 years and I thought I knew what discipline looked like. But watching you guys today, it's different. It's something more." The guard's expression didn't change, but Marcus sensed a shift in his attention. It was like the moment in a fight when your opponent stops thinking about their game plan and starts really listening to what you're doing. Marcus pulled out the photograph of Sarah, holding it up so the guard could see it through the bars. "This is my daughter. She's 8 years old and she's fighting leukemia. The doctors say she needs an experimental treatment that costs more money than I've ever seen in my life." For the first time, Guardsman Williams's eyes moved slightly, glancing down at the photograph before returning to their forward position. The movement was so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but Marcus caught it. In that brief glance, he saw something that gave him hope, compassion. "I've won fights against men twice my size," Marcus continued, his voice becoming more passionate. "I've taken hits that would put most people in the hospital and kept fighting. But this, watching my little girl get weaker every day while I can't do anything about it, ... It's the hardest fight I've ever faced." A small group of tourists approached, and Marcus stepped back, allowing them to take their photos. He waited patiently as they chattered and moved on, never taking his eyes off Guardsman Williams. There was something about the man's unwavering composure that Marcus found both inspiring and challenging. When the tourists were gone, Marcus approached the gate again. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he admitted. "Maybe it's because you understand what it means to stand your ground when everything else is falling apart. Maybe it's because I need to talk to someone who won't judge me for feeling lost." Guardsman Williams remained motionless, but Marcus could sense the man's attention like a physical presence. It reminded him of the moment before a fight when both boxers were sizing each other up, looking for weaknesses and strengths. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "I've been thinking about doing something desperate. There's this underground fighting circuit that pays big money, but it's dangerous. No rules, no safety measures. Men have died in those rings. My wife would never forgive me if she knew I was even considering it. But the money from one fight could pay for Sarah's treatment." The admission hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Marcus had never said those words out loud to anyone, not even to himself in his darkest moments. But something about this guard's presence made him feel safe to voice his deepest fears and temptations. A slight breeze rustled the Union Jack flying above the palace, and Marcus watched as Guardsman Williams's eyes tracked the movement before returning to their steady forward gaze. The man's discipline was absolute, but Marcus was beginning to understand that it wasn't the rigid discipline of a machine. It was the conscious choice of a man who had learned to master himself. "You know what I realized watching the ceremony today?" Marcus asked, not really expecting an answer. "Strength isn't just about how hard you can hit or how much punishment you can take. It's about doing the right thing even when it's the hardest thing. It's about standing your ground for something bigger than yourself." As if in response to his words, Guardsman Williams shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. A movement so small, it could have been dismissed as muscle memory. But Marcus recognized it as acknowledgement. The guard was listening, truly listening. "I've been so focused on trying to be the hero who saves the day that I forgot what real heroism looks like," Marcus continued. "It looks like you, standing here hour after hour, protecting something sacred, not because it's easy or exciting, but because it's right. It looks like my wife, working double shifts and never complaining. It looks like my daughter, smiling through her pain because she doesn't want us to worry." The realization hit Marcus like a left hook he never saw coming. He had been so desperate to find a dramatic solution to his problems that he had missed the quiet heroism happening all around him. The real fight wasn't about finding enough money for the treatment. It was about finding the strength to keep going one day at a time. A black cab pulled up nearby, and its passenger, an elderly man in an expensive suit, stepped out and began walking toward the palace gates. He moved with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to being watched and respected. As he approached, Guardsman Williams's posture, if possible, became even more perfect. The elderly man paused near Marcus, studying him with curious eyes. There was something familiar about his face, but Marcus couldn't place him. The man's gaze shifted to the photograph Marcus was still holding, and his expression softened. "Beautiful child," the man said quietly, his voice carrying the refined accent of the upper class. "Is she ill?" Marcus nodded, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance and his reason for being there. "Cancer," he said simply. The elderly man's eyes showed genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry to hear that. Children shouldn't have to face such battles." He looked at Guardsman Williams, then back at Marcus. "But they often show us what real courage looks like, don't they?" Before Marcus could respond, the man walked on, approaching the palace entrance with the familiarity of someone who belonged there. Marcus watched him go, wondering who he was and why his brief words had carried such weight. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the palace courtyard when Marcus noticed something unexpected. Guardsman Williams's shift was coming to an end, and another guard was approaching to relieve him. The changing of positions was executed with military precision. But Marcus caught something in Williams's eyes as he prepared to march away, a look that seemed to say their conversation wasn't over, as Williams began his measured march toward the palace. Marcus felt an overwhelming urge to follow. Something about their silent exchange had stirred something deep inside him, a recognition of shared struggle that transcended their very different worlds. Without fully understanding why, Marcus began walking along the outside of the palace perimeter. Keeping pace with the guards' movements inside the gates, the elderly gentleman from earlier was now standing near the palace entrance. Speaking quietly with an official-looking man in a dark suit, Marcus noticed the way palace staff deferred to him, bowing slightly as they passed. There was clearly more to this man than Marcus had initially realized. But his attention was drawn back to Guardsman Williams. As Williams reached the end of his ceremonial march, something unprecedented happened. The guard paused for just a moment, barely a heartbeat, and turned his head slightly toward where Marcus stood outside the gates. The movement was so subtle that anyone else would have missed it, but Marcus caught it. In that brief glance, something that shocked him, tears in the guard's eyes. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. This man, this symbol of unwavering strength and discipline, was human. He was carrying his own burdens, his own pain, his own struggles. The perfect composure wasn't the absence of emotion. It was the mastery of it. Marcus pressed closer to the gates, his hands gripping the iron bars. "Wait," he called out softly, not wanting to cause a scene, but desperate to maintain the connection he felt with this stranger who somehow understood his pain. Williams paused in his march, a violation of protocol that could have serious consequences. For a moment, the two men looked at each other across the barrier of palace gates and social conventions. In that moment, Marcus saw past the uniform to the man beneath, someone who knew what it meant to stand strong when everything inside you was breaking. The elderly gentleman noticed the exchange and began walking over with curiosity evident on his face. His steps were measured and purposeful, like someone accustomed to inserting himself into situations that required delicate handling. "Guardsman Williams," the man said in a voice that carried natural authority. At ease, Williams snapped to attention, but Marcus could see the surprise in his eyes. The elderly gentleman had spoken with the casual command of someone very high in the palace hierarchy. Marcus began to realize he might be witnessing something far more significant than a chance encounter. "Sir?" Williams responded, his voice trained and professional despite the emotional moment Marcus had just witnessed. The elderly man turned to Marcus, his eyes kind but penetrating. "And you are the father we were discussing, I presume? The boxer with the sick daughter?" Marcus's confusion must have been evident on his face, because the man smiled gently. "Word travels quickly in these halls, young man. Your conversation with Guardsman Williams has been ... observed." The realization that he had been watched made Marcus nervous, but the man's manner was reassuring rather than threatening. There was something grandfatherly about his approach, despite the obvious power he wielded. "I don't understand," Marcus said honestly. "Who are you?" "Someone who has learned that the most important conversations often happen in the most unexpected places," the man replied diplomatically. "Guardsman Williams, would you mind sharing with our friend here what you told me about your own situation?" Williams looked uncertain, glancing between the elderly gentleman and Marcus. Protocol clearly dictated one response, but human compassion seemed to be pulling him in another direction. "It's all right, son," the elderly man encouraged. "Sometimes sharing our burdens makes them lighter." Williams took a deep breath, his composure wavering for the first time since Marcus had been watching him. "My younger brother is deployed in Afghanistan," he said quietly. "He was injured in an IED explosion 3 weeks ago. He's in a coma, and the doctors don't know if he'll wake up." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Here was this man, standing guard with perfect discipline, while carrying the weight of his family's crisis. The strength that must have taken to maintain his duties while his heart was breaking was beyond anything Marcus had experienced in the boxing ring. "I've been watching you both," the elderly gentleman continued, "and I've been struck by something remarkable. Two men from very different backgrounds, facing very different challenges, yet united by the same fundamental struggle: how to be strong for the people we love when we feel anything but strong selves." Marcus felt exposed, as if this stranger could see straight through to his soul. "I don't feel strong," he admitted. "I feel like I'm failing everyone who depends on me." "And yet you're here," the man pointed out. "Not at home wallowing in self-pity, not pursuing those dangerous fights you mentioned, but here, seeking inspiration from men who have dedicated their lives to serving something greater than themselves." The fact that the man knew about Marcus's consideration of underground fighting made it clear just how closely their conversation had been monitored. But rather than feeling violated, Marcus felt understood. Someone in a position of power was actually listening to his struggle. Williams spoke up unexpectedly. "When I heard about your daughter," he said to Marcus, his voice thick with emotion, "it made me think about my brother. About how we keep fighting not because we're guaranteed to win, but because giving up isn't an option when someone we love is counting on us." The parallel struck both men simultaneously. They were both warriors in their own ways, one in the boxing ring, one in military service, but their real battles were being fought in hospital waiting rooms and sleepless nights filled with worry. "There's something I'd like you both to consider," the elderly gentleman said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. The palace receives hundreds of requests for assistance every month. Most are from organizations or official channels, but sometimes rarely. We encounter individuals whose stories remind us why these institutions exist in the first place. Marcus felt his heart begin to race. Was this man suggesting what he thought he was suggesting? "I'm not promising anything," the gentleman continued quickly, "but I would like you to meet with someone tomorrow. Someone who specializes in connecting people facing medical crises with resources they might not have known were available." The offer was so unexpected that Marcus almost couldn't process it. After months of feeling helpless, a stranger was offering hope. But something held him back from jumping at the opportunity immediately. "Why?" Marcus asked. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me?" The elderly gentleman smiled. And for the first time, Marcus caught a glimpse of something almost paternal in his expression. Because sometimes the most important thing we can do is recognize courage when we see it, even when the person showing it doesn't recognize it in themselves. The next morning arrived with an unusual crispness that seemed to mirror the nervous energy coursing through Marcus's body. He had barely slept, replaying the previous day's encounter over and over in his mind. Emma had been suspicious when he came home with a strange new lightness in his step, but he hadn't been ready to explain what had happened. How could he tell his wife that he had poured his heart out to a palace guard and somehow caught the attention of someone with real power? The address he had been given led him to a modest building near Westminster, far less imposing than he had expected. The brass nameplate by the door read, "The Royal Foundation Support Services," and Marcus realized he was about to enter a world he never knew existed. Inside, the atmosphere was professional but warm. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, seemed to be expecting him. "Mr. Thompson, please have a seat. Lady Catherine will see you shortly." Marcus settled into a comfortable chair, his eyes taking in the walls lined with photographs of various charitable events and royal family members meeting with people from all walks of life. The images told stories of connection across social barriers, of the monarchy's role in supporting the most vulnerable members of society. "Mr. Thompson," a woman's voice interrupted his observations. He looked up to see an elegantly dressed woman in her 50s, approaching with an outstretched hand. "I'm Lady Catherine Morrison. Thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm and genuine. Marcus immediately sensed that despite her title and refined manner, this was someone who understood real problems faced by real people. She led him into a comfortable office where tea was already waiting. "I understand you met the Duke yesterday," Lady Catherine said without preamble. Settling into her chair with practiced grace. "The Duke?" Marcus asked, confusion evident in his voice. Lady Catherine smiled. "The elderly gentleman you spoke with at the palace? He was quite moved by your story and your interaction with Guardsman Williams. He felt it was important that we explore ways to help your family." The realization that he had been speaking with actual royalty the day before hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had poured out his heart to a member of the royal family without even knowing it. The thought should have been intimidating, but somehow it felt right. The man's genuine compassion had been real. Regardless of his title, he mentioned that your daughter needs specialized treatment. Lady Catherine continued gently. "Would you be comfortable sharing more details about her condition?" For the next hour, Marcus found himself telling Sarah's story to someone who listened with both professional expertise and genuine emotional investment. Lady Catherine asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's treatment plan, the family's financial situation, and the emotional toll the illness was taking on everyone involved. "There are several programs that might be able to help," Lady Catherine explained after Marcus finished his account. "The Royal Foundation partners with various medical charities and research institutions. We also have connections with private donors who specifically support families facing medical crises." The hope that had been building in Chess's chest threatened to overwhelm him. "I don't understand how this is possible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yesterday, I was ready to risk everything in illegal fights just to pay for her treatment. And now you're telling me there might be legitimate help available?" Lady Catherine leaned forward, her expression serious but kind. "Mr. Thompson, what happened yesterday wasn't just chance. The Duke has been working in charitable causes for decades. and he has developed an instinct for recognizing when someone genuinely needs help versus when they simply want something. Your conversation with Guardsman Williams, your obvious love for your daughter, your struggle with maintaining your dignity while facing an impossible situation, all of that painted a picture of a man worthy of support. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. But I want to be clear about something. Any assistance we might be able to provide isn't charity in the traditional sense. It's an investment in a family that has shown resilience and character under extreme pressure. Marcus felt tears threatening to fall, something that rarely happened, even in his most emotional moments. What would I need to do? First, we need complete medical records and financial documentation. Our medical advisory board will need to review Sarah's case to determine the best course of action. We also have counselors who work with families navigating these crises. The emotional support is just as important as the financial assistance. The conversation continued for another hour, with Lady Catherine explaining various programs and possibilities. Marcus learned about research trials that might be available to Sarah, about support groups for families facing childhood cancer, and about financial assistance programs he never knew existed. As they prepared to conclude the meeting, Lady Catherine asked a question that caught Marcus off guard. The Duke mentioned that you were considering underground fighting to raise money. What made you step back from that decision? Marcus thought carefully about his answer. Watching Guardsman Williams, he said finally. Seeing his discipline, his commitment to doing the right thing, even when it's hard. I realized that the kind of father I want to be for Sarah isn't the kind who takes shortcuts or risks his life for quick money. She needs me to be strong the right way, not just the dramatic way. Lady Catherine nodded approvingly. The Duke thought you might say something like that. He has a particular respect for people who choose the harder but more honorable path. As Marcus prepared to leave, Lady Catherine handed him a folder containing various forms and information packets. I want you to know that regardless of what specific assistance we can provide, you and your family are no longer facing this alone. Sometimes that knowledge alone can make the burden feel lighter. Walking out of the building, Marcus felt like a different man than the one who had entered. The weight of desperation that had been crushing him for months had lifted, replaced by something he had almost forgotten existed. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Thompson, this is Guardsman Williams. I wanted you to know that my brother woke up this morning. The doctors say he's going to make a full recovery. Sometimes good things happen when we least expect them. I hope the same is true for your daughter. Marcus stopped walking and read the message 3 times, a smile spreading across his face. 2 men who had been strangers 24 hours ago had somehow become connected in their struggles, and now, possibly, in their victories. He thought about calling Emma to share the news, but decided instead to go home and tell her in person. After months of bringing home disappointment and worry, he was finally returning with something precious: hope, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important conversations happen between strangers who recognize something essential in each other. The walk home seemed shorter than usual, and for the first time in months, Marcus found himself looking forward to the future instead of dreading it. His daughter's fight was far from over, but she no longer had to face it with just her parents' love and determination. She had an entire support system she didn't even know existed, all because her father had decided to pour his heart out to a palace guard who understood what it meant to stand strong when everything inside you was falling apart. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself in a place he never thought he would be, standing in the same courtyard where his life had changed. This time he wasn't alone. Sarah held his hand tightly, her small fingers intertwined with his calloused ones. She wore a colorful scarf wrapped around her head, a cheerful attempt to hide the effects of her ongoing treatment. But her eyes sparkled with the excitement of a child on an adventure. Emma walked on Sarah's other side, her arm linked protectively around their daughter's shoulders. The stress lines that had become permanent fixtures on her face over the past months had softened considerably since Marcus had shared the news about the Royal Foundation's assistance. The experimental treatment that had seemed financially impossible was now becoming a reality. Sarah had responded better than anyone had dared to hope. "Is that him, Daddy?" Sarah asked, pointing toward the guard standing at attention near the palace gates. "Is that the man who helped us?" Marcus smiled down at his daughter. Over the past weeks, Sarah had become fascinated by the story of how her father had met Guardsman Williams. In her 8-year-old mind, the guard had become something of a fairy tale hero, and she had insisted on coming to thank him in person. "That's him." "Sweetheart," Marcus confirmed, though he felt a flutter of nervousness. This return visit had been arranged through Lady Catherine, but Marcus wasn't entirely sure how Williams would react to seeing them again, especially with Sarah present. The guard in question was indeed Williams, though he was positioned at a different post than during their first encounter. As the family approached, Marcus caught the slight widening of the guard's eyes, the only indication that he recognized them. Sarah, with the fearlessness that only children possess, walked right up to the palace gates and stood directly in front of Williams. "Hello," she said in her clear, sweet voice. "I'm Sarah. You helped my daddy help me." For a moment, something flickered across Williams's composed features. Marcus saw the guard's jaw tighten slightly, and he realized the man was fighting to maintain his professional composure while being confronted with the very real, very alive child whose story had touched him so deeply. Emma stepped forward, her voice gentle but carrying across the distance between them. "We wanted you to know that Sarah started the new treatment last week. The doctors are very optimistic." Williams remained perfectly still, but Marcus caught the slight relaxation in his shoulders, a release of tension that spoke of relief and joy that couldn't be expressed in words. A small crowd of tourists had begun to gather, curious about the family's obvious connection to the stoic guard. Sarah, oblivious to the attention, continued her one-sided conversation. "Daddy told me you have a brother who was hurt but got better," she said, matter-of-factly. "I'm getting better too. Maybe we can all be better together." The simple wisdom of her words hit everyone within earshot. Marcus saw several tourists wipe their eyes, moved by the sight of this brave little girl offering comfort to a man who couldn't respond, but whose emotion was evident to anyone paying attention. Then something unexpected happened. From across the courtyard, a familiar figure began approaching. The Duke, the same elderly gentleman who had changed everything with his intervention, walked toward them with purpose. He was accompanied by a small entourage. His attention was focused entirely on the scene unfolding before him. "Good afternoon," the Duke said warmly, his voice carrying easily across the space. "I believe some introductions are in order." The crowd that had gathered began to whisper excitedly as they realized they were witnessing something special. Camera phones appeared, but the palace security team smoothly managed the situation. Ensuring privacy while allowing the moment to unfold naturally, the Duke approached Sarah with the gentle manner of someone accustomed to speaking with children. "You must be the brave young lady I've heard so much about," he said. Crouching down to her level, despite his advanced age, Sarah's eyes went wide with recognition of authority, but her natural boldness won out. "Are you the king?" she asked directly. The Duke chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to put everyone at ease. "Not quite, my dear, but I do work for someone very important who wanted me to meet you." He turned to address Williams directly, something that caused a stir among the watching crowd. "Guardsman Williams, I have some news I thought you'd want to hear. Your brother has been approved for transfer to the rehabilitation center in London. He'll be much closer to home for the rest of his recovery." For the first time since Marcus had known him, Williams's composure cracked completely. Tears ran openly down his face, though he maintained his rigid posture. The sight of this strong man allowing his emotion to show publicly was profoundly moving. "At ease, son," the Duke said gently. "I think today calls for a different kind of protocol." Williams relaxed his stance, but remained standing. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how to express what this means to my family." The Duke waved away his thanks. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is recognize when good people are facing impossible situations and find ways to make those situations a little less impossible." He turned to Marcus and Emma, his expression warm with genuine affection. "And how is our boxing champion adjusting to his new career path?" Marcus felt himself flush with pride and embarrassment. One of the conditions of the Royal Foundation's assistance had been Marcus's agreement to work with at-risk youth, using his boxing skills to teach discipline and self-respect to kids who needed positive role models. The work paid modestly, but it was steady income that allowed him to support his family while being present for Sarah's treatment. "It's different from what I expected," Marcus admitted. "But good different. These kids remind me why I fell in love with boxing in the first place, not for the violence, but for the strength and discipline it builds." Sarah, who had been listening quietly, suddenly piped up. "Daddy teaches kids to be strong like the guardman," she announced proudly. The Duke smiled at her simple summary. "That sounds like exactly the right kind of work, for exactly the right kind of man." As the unusual gathering began to wind down, the Duke made one final gesture that would be talked about for years to come. He stepped over to Williams and, in full view of the gathered crowd and cameras, shook the guard's hand. "Thank you for your service, Guardsman Williams," he said formally, "both to your country and to the family standing beside us today. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with compassion and the willingness to see our shared humanity." The crowd that had gathered burst into spontaneous applause, moved by witnessing something that felt both historic and deeply personal. Marcus realized that what had started as a desperate father's breakdown had somehow become a symbol of how connection and compassion could bridge any divide. As the Duke and his entourage departed, Sarah tugged on her father's sleeve. "Can we come back and visit the guardman again?" she asked. Marcus looked at Williams, who gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But clear as day to Marcus. "I think that can be arranged," Marcus said, lifting his daughter into his arms. After all, friends should visit each other, as they walked away from the palace. Marcus felt the weight of the past year settling into perspective. The crisis that had nearly destroyed his family had instead led them to discover strength they didn't know they possessed in connections they never could have imagined. Sometimes the most important confrontations weren't fought in boxing rings, but in moments of vulnerability that revealed the best in human nature. 6 months later, the autumn sun painted the palace courtyard in shades of gold and amber as an extraordinary ceremony prepared to unfold. Marcus stood in an unfamiliar but comfortable suit, his calloused hands smoothed with nervous energy. Beside him, Emma radiated quiet pride in her elegant blue dress, while Sarah practically bounced with excitement in her new outfit. Her hair having grown back in soft curls that caught the afternoon light, the invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Written on official palace stationery in elegant script, it requested the pleasure of the Thompson family's company at a special recognition ceremony honoring exemplary service and the power of human connection in times of crisis. Marcus had read it 5 times before, believing it was real today. The usual tourist crowds had been replaced by a more select gathering. Families who had been touched by the Royal Foundation's work sat alongside military personnel and palace staff. Marcus recognized several faces from the youth center where he now worked full-time. Young people whose lives had been changed by learning that strength came not from violence, but from discipline and purpose. Guardsman Williams stood at attention near the palace entrance. But today, his uniform bore subtle differences, new insignia that Marcus didn't recognize, but which clearly indicated some form of promotion or special recognition. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and Williams offered the slightest smile, a gesture that would have been unthinkable during their first encounter. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice announced over a discreet sound system. "His Royal Highness, the Duke of Cambridge." The crowd rose as the Duke emerged from the palace. But today he was accompanied by someone who made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. Walking beside him was a woman whose presence commanded instant respect and recognition, though she moved with the same warm approachability that had characterized the Dukes. "Interactions with their family, is that?" Emma whispered, her voice filled with awe. "I think it is," Marcus replied. Hardly believing what he was seeing, Sarah, oblivious to the significance of the moment, waved enthusiastically at the approaching figures. To everyone's delight, the distinguished woman waved back with genuine warmth. Today the Duke began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "We gather to celebrate something that makes our institution truly meaningful, the power of human connection to bridge any divide and create positive change in the world." He gestured toward Marcus and his family. Several months ago, a desperate father found himself outside these gates, not seeking an audience or demanding attention, but simply looking for hope in the face of his daughter's life-threatening illness. His conversation with one of our guardsmen created a ripple effect that reminds us why service, whether in the military, in our communities, or in our families, matters so deeply. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as the Duke continued. "Guardsman Williams, step forward, please." Williams marched with perfect precision to stand before the Duke and his distinguished companion. The crowd watched in respectful silence as the ceremony began to unfold. "Guardsman Williams," the Duke announced, "your compassion and dedication to duty, demonstrated not just in your service to the crown, but in your humanity toward a stranger in distress, exemplify the finest traditions of the Queen's Guard. You are hereby promoted to Lance Sergeant and appointed as a special liaison for the Royal Foundation's family support programs." The crowd erupted in applause as Williams received his new insignia. Marcus watched with pride and amazement as the man who had been a stranger just months ago was honored for the very qualities that had drawn them together in the first place. But the ceremony wasn't finished. The Duke turned toward Marcus's family with a warm smile. "Mr. Thompson, would you please step forward with your family?" Marcus felt his legs trembling as he, Emma, and Sarah approached the palace steps. Sarah skipped alongside her parents, was completely comfortable in a situation that would have terrified most adults. "Your story," the Duke continued, "has become an inspiration to everyone who has heard it. Not because of the assistance you received, but because of the strength and dignity you showed when facing an impossible situation. Your decision to seek help through honorable means, rather than risking everything in underground fighting, demonstrated exactly the kind of character we hope to support." The distinguished woman stepped forward, and Marcus realized he was about to be addressed by a member of the royal family whose image he had seen countless times, but never imagined meeting in person. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice warm and genuine. "I understand that you've been working with young people, teaching them about discipline and resilience through boxing. Is that correct?" "Yes, Yes, ma'am," Marcus managed, his voice stronger than he had expected. "It's been the most rewarding work of my life. And Sarah," she continued, kneeling down to the little girl's level with practiced grace, "how are you feeling, my dear?" Sarah, with the honesty of childhood, replied, "Much better. The doctors say the medicine is working really well, and my hair grew back prettier than before." The royal visitor laughed, a sound of genuine delight that seemed to put everyone at ease. "It certainly did," she agreed. "You're a very brave young lady." She stood and addressed the crowd. "This family's story reminds us that the monarchy's role isn't to stand apart from the people we serve, but to recognize and support the extraordinary, ordinary people who make our society strong. Sometimes the most important conversations happen not in formal settings, but between strangers who recognize something essential in each other." The Duke stepped forward with an elegant wooden box. "Mr. Thompson, in recognition of your service to Etrusc youth and your exemplary character in the face of adversity, please accept this commendation from the Royal Foundation. Along with our commitment to continue supporting your work with young people," as Marcus accepted the box. The crowd's applause was joined by cheering from the group of teenagers from his youth center, who had been invited to witness the ceremony. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and soon the entire gathering was celebrating with genuine joy. But the most moving moment came when Sarah, with the fearlessness that had characterized all her interactions with the palace, walked up to Lance Sergeant Williams and held out her hand. "Thank you for helping my daddy help me," she said. Simply Williams, with tears in his eyes but a smile on his face, knelt down and shook her small hand with the same serious respect he would show to any dignitary. "Thank you for teaching all of us what real courage looks like," he replied, as the ceremony concluded, and the crowd began to mingle. Marcus found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as the darkest period of his life had somehow transformed into a story of hope, connection, and purpose that he never could have imagined. The boxing ring had taught him about individual strength and the will to keep fighting when everything hurt. But these past months had taught him something even more valuable, that the most important victories weren't won alone, but through the connections we make with others who understand our struggles and choose to help us carry the load. Emma slipped her hand into his as they watched, Sarah chatting animatedly with other children who had been touched by the Royal Foundation's work. "Can you believe this is our life now?" she asked softly. Marcus squeezed her hand, watching their daughter's animated gestures as she told her story to new friends. "A year ago, I thought I knew what fighting looked like," he said. "I thought it was about being strong enough to handle everything alone. Now I know that real strength is being brave enough to let others help you win the fights that matter most." As the golden afternoon light began to fade, the Thompson family prepared to leave the palace grounds for what would certainly not be the last time. They had arrived as strangers seeking help, but they were leaving as part of a community that had formed around the simple recognition that everyone, regardless of their station in life, faces battles that are easier to win when we're not fighting alone. The guard, who had started as a symbol of unshakable discipline, had become a friend. The desperate father had become a mentor to struggling youth. And the sick little girl had become a reminder that hope and healing could emerge from the darkest circumstances. Sometimes the most unlikely confrontations lead to the most beautiful transformations, and the roaring of the crowd comes not from witnessing conflict, but from celebrating the triumph of human connection over impossible odds.